For over 33 months, Russia's waging war against Ukraine, and today we want to examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Replica, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start in the western Russian region of Kursk. There, the Russian army continues to be unsuccessful in reclaiming the approximately 500 square kilometers of territory held by Ukraine. We have new footage showing us that the Russian efforts have also declined significantly. Here we see a BMD-2, which is an example of an armored vehicle used by the Russian army, first driving over a mine. And we see these are very recent shots in winter conditions. And then also, when all the soldiers are forced to dismount because the vehicle has been immobilized and cannot move forward any longer, it is now coming under attack by kamikaze drones. This illustrates that the efforts of the Russian army to make progress in this area have significantly dwindled from 10 tanks and infantry fighting vehicles per day to possibly just around 1 per day, who is still trying to conquer any smaller positions here. However, as mentioned, this has gone down significantly, very much compared to November. What has happened instead is that Ukraine is systematically targeting every Russian soldier with kamikaze drones, and of course also targeting technology like surveillance cameras that are deployed around the areas occupied by Ukraine. We observe various types of soldiers making attempts to approach, trying to support their positions or to deliver ammunition or food supplies to the front lines. All these efforts are systematically targeted by hundreds of Ukrainian kamikaze drones each and every day. This indicates that we continue to have a large, strong, and very potent Ukrainian military force present in Kursk, likely consisting of several thousand soldiers, as well as the experts we see here who are employing their highly sophisticated methods. They're very high-quality kamikaze drones. It always depends on the unit deploying them. Some units are very familiar with them, while other units use them only rarely, and the drones themselves vary a lot. We know that some drones are just like that you only have about 20% success. Other drones are so well built and have been tested multiple times beforehand that 50%, sometimes even 70% hit the target in the end without electronic warfare. Insofar as these are special units that are further utilized, and now we see at the end that the Russians are trying to tow away a tank here, nonetheless even. This attempt to recover another tank from the area ultimately ends up failing as well in the end, because we have the Ukrainian drone here which hits directly up front. Let's take another look at the situation on the map and really consider if Russia should make a serious attempt to regain control of this area before Trump assumes presidential power in a little over a month's time. Then it will become quite difficult. We have just observed that the situation really hasn't undergone much change. These various attacks we've seen with the drones have actually happened in those other places just outside, where it goes directly to the highway to Kursk. Is that happening near Kursk city, outside the occupied territory in the occupied area? Very little is happening. We don't just see no or very few Ukrainian recordings. What's interesting is that we also see hardly any Russian footage showing us that a systematic attack is taking place here. We keep seeing the Russians using these kamikaze drones on these fiber optic cables. However, that's really just in this particular area, so it's only happening here at Darino and at Sverdlokovo. In that area, they repeatedly try to force the Ukrainians out from 1 or 2 of those villages. Even though it's possible, we see the total distance up there, that's 14 kilometers. That means you could easily fly from Giri to Sucha with various drones, even with Lancet drones or similar ones. But that's not happening. This means we have no systematic Russian attacks on the infrastructure, on the position, and on the logistics of Ukraine in this area. But instead, the Russians are focusing on conquering Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine. The west of Russia is considered secondary at this point. Our focus is shifting to the eastern region of Ukraine, where additional footage highlights the deteriorating situation for Ukrainians, especially around Kurakhove, situated in the southeast of the front. We have footage from the Ukrainian army from the small village of Sukiyali, which means a small village that formerly had about 300 inhabitants. But here, and we also see that in these recordings, it is completely under Russian control now. And we can see that from these recordings where Ukrainian kamikaze drones enter the various houses into the different positions of the Russian soldiers. And we see various shots from different parts of the village. So on the one hand, we again see effective attacks. We also see abandoned or damaged Russian vehicles standing there. That means we can again assume that a large part of the Russian invasions dies here. However, we notice that the entire situation is now only observed from a distance by the Ukrainians. We see that apparently the Russians have occupied the entire village. Also from this massive destruction, we can see that probably No more Ukrainian positions remaining within this locality anymore. And unfortunately, this clearly shows us that this small village of Suki is quite likely completely under Russian control. And if that's the case, then the soldiers to the east, the Ukrainian soldiers to the east, have an increasingly bigger problem. Because Suki is situated on one of the very important roads that lead into this particular area. In recent weeks, we've shown how Konstantinivka, Ilinka, Romanivka, and so on, all these small villages have been captured by the Russian army one after another. In Konstantinopolski, we now know that the Russian army has taken about half of this location. This suggests that the Ukrainians have very little chance to move in and out of the area, much less effectively supply their logistics with fresh ammunition, food, and other essential supplies. And this is, as we see, a very difficult situation. Moreover, the Russians are doing exactly what we already had previously suspected, namely after capturing Bresky and Ilinka and so forth north of Kurakhove, north of this reservoir, they are now advancing southward and making an attempt to cut off the city directly from the western side. This means the situation here is becoming more and more dramatic. Yes, the Ukrainians can still somehow hold the situation, but we are not seeing any progress here, rather continuous slow setbacks or a gradual advance of the Russian army around Kurakhove, which implies that this location too will likely fall sometime in the near future. We move on to Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. There is also a Russian offensive there trying to take control of Kharkiv. And here we have very interesting footage from the Ukrainian army, which shows us just how important and also high quality these drones have become. What the Russians have constructed here is located over an intersection where two streets actually come together. We see one goes diagonally this way and one goes there, that the entire intersection is covered in nets. This suggests that the Russians have put significant effort into securing their checkpoint at this particular intersection against drone attacks. Only for some specific reason. Well, what do you mean for some specific reason? To allow vehicles to still relatively easily use this road, the front and back parts of this intersection were of course intentionally left open, so you don't have to move a big net to the side when a vehicle comes through. But the Ukrainians are taking advantage by flying underneath the net. These nets are all around them, not just on the sides, but if we look closely, that's also up here. There is a mesh or net too, where the entire street is completely covered. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians use their own kamikaze drones, which can now fly very precisely, clearly have a very strong signal here, and move into the center of the intersection, into the middle of the Russian checkpoint, and attack it there. That means all these ideas that one has about nets and cages are basically a placebo for the respective soldiers to provide them with that comforting feeling that they are truly safe while stationed here. In Kupiansk, it's indeed quite feasible for Ukraine to effectively target strategic military positions and also disrupt the activities of forward deployed Russian soldiers stationed there. And that happens with kamikaze drones around. We can even see them flying right into bunkers. That means there are hardly any ways to stop them. Nonetheless, we want to take another look at the situation in Kupiansk. And we also see there that the Russian army is trying to advance further with a lot of effort. However, it's Kharkiv, and in Kharkiv, the Ukrainians seem to be trying even harder than in Donetsk, at least it seems that way, to prevent these advances. That means Kupiansk here on the eastern bank. We can briefly trace the east bank again. You can see a bit here. It follows along this river, remains under Ukrainian control for the time being, and the Russians are actively attempting what we just observed, attempting to push southwards in the areas of Kislivka and Petropavlivka, or from the eastern side, striving to take control over the entire region situated there. In this area, Ukrainians make it exceptionally tough for them. We see a relatively firm or a relatively stagnant front line, quite different from around Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, where the Russians advance 1 or 2 kilometers every day. What the Russians have managed is here in the south, to cut through the area once. This essentially means that we currently have a southern portion of the Oskil region, or a southern eastern bank of the Oskil, which is firmly under Ukrainian control, and a northern eastern bank of the Oskil, which is also under Ukrainian control. They managed to break through and reach the river, but it hasn't resulted in any major change yet. That this pocket, so to speak, between the river and the Russian front line has become smaller, noticeably smaller, or maybe has even collapsed entirely. When discussing placebo, the Russians are trying everything to make their soldiers feel they can defend against the kamikaze threat. Then the following footage vividly underscores just how increasingly desperate and dire the situation has now become. Because we see here, actually, civilian vehicles modified in a Mad Max style to protect them somehow. That means We actually see small buses, standard loaders, and other similar vehicles, but all of them have been reinforced and transformed. On one hand, with a drone anti-drone mechanism strategically installed, and on the other, we can observe it also with relatively thick, heavily reinforced plates covering the hood and various other parts to provide the possibility there that the explosion of the kamikaze drone does not immediately shut off the engine. But if we take a very close look at the whole thing, then one must, this is slightly sarcastic now, one must really count a bit on the goodwill of the drone pilot that he attacks precisely from above or from the front, because from both sides and from behind there is no armor at all, and not even doors we see here to stop it all. That means the whole thing is a bit of a desperate attempt to somehow create a way to move from point A to B, and that with these pseudo-armored vehicles. This clearly shows us that not everything looks rosy with the Russian army, namely due to the thousands of lost tanks and armored personnel carriers. They are now also, at least in some parts of the front lines, they rely on such vehicles to effectively move the Russian soldiers. This situation underscores how truly desperate things are. No armored vehicles, no alternatives to rely on, and no chance to import anything needed. China does not want this for now in order to have a proper protected transport to move their own soldiers from point A to B. Instead, they are these so-called suicide vehicles which offer virtually no protection whatsoever to the soldiers inside, but they just appear somewhat interesting or eye-catching. We want to watch a recording released by Ukraine, which was actually published by a Russian soldier to show how defenseless you are with your own Grad rocket launchers when you're under the fire of your own homeland's territory. So when you're being attacked by specifically targeted and expertly guided missiles of the Ukrainian army from home-mounted gun platforms like the M142. What we see here and on the horizon is a rocket launcher. It's already set up, aligned, and about to launch its 40 rockets towards Ukrainian cities or positions, and we see a Russian soldier wants to film the whole thing. However, what is happening now, we will see it from above in a moment, is a rocket, specifically a HIMARS rocket, that hits directly and leads to the destruction of the position. A fire breaks out here, causing all rockets to launch uncontrollably. We can observe that right when the fire, so to speak, occurs, or while the rockets are being launched, we actually always experience a few seconds in between where it remains relatively calm. But we see that a fire has broken out here, right at the BM-21 Grad launcher, and that nothing is happening in a controlled manner anymore with this vehicle, and presumably also the soldiers who were present at the scene, destroyed or killed right here. We see here, once again, very briefly before the event, here we can see it. That is the Russian soldier who moves away from the launcher and then runs to the left from our viewpoint, and precisely at that location, the HIMARS rocket hits directly, which then leads to the destruction of both the ammunition stored nearby and the BM-21 Grad rocket launcher, which with its range of about 20 kilometers has only a quarter of the range. This HIMARS rocket that just hit here. At the end, we want to look at striking footage, or so far unique footage, of an interception by a helicopter of the Ukrainian army. These are 4-meter-long Geran-2 kamikaze drones. Sometimes Russia sends hundreds of these Geran-2 drones in a single night to overwhelm the defense. And these recordings again illustrate just how peculiar and unusual these weapon systems really are. Here we see one of them, which is relatively easy to recognize, one of these Geran-2, or originally called the Shahed 136. From Iranian production, but they are now built in Russia. What kind of strange weapon systems that is. That means we see this massive 4-meter-long drone with about 2-meter wingspan here. And we see how this drone slowly moves through the Ukrainian airspace. What we are currently seeing with the drone just visible on the screen is a Mi-8 helicopter belonging to the Ukrainian Air Force. And he's tracking the drone. It's relatively easy for him because the drone only flies about 150 kilometers per hour. The helicopter can fly up to twice as fast. And now, what we can only guess, but we can see relatively well, is that a machine gun is being fired from the helicopter at this drone. This was hit here for the first time. That means we see smoke coming out for the first time. Now there's going to be another machine gun hit. And then we actually see how this drone gradually loses altitude and ends up crashing into the forest directly beneath it. I believe it should be happening any moment now. Now we see it, more clouds coming out, far explosions happening there. And the reason why the helicopter is keeping a relatively large distance is because they don't know if now the engine or the or the explosives are hit, and if the entire explosive inside goes off into the air, and in that case, of course, you should be several dozen meters away from this explosion, or whether, as is happening now, the motor is hit and this drone crashes here. But that's actually the kind of crazy situation I wanted to talk about, that these Geran 2 drones are sometimes in the air for 2 to 3 hours, flying around within Ukraine, relatively slowly or sluggishly from A to B. They naturally have a programmed course, but it takes several hours. And if you have a good radar system, if you have a good way, even with other technical means, to see from where to where this drone is currently flying, then it is even possible to dispatch helicopters promptly to track down and shoot these drones out of the sky. However, it's precisely the sheer volume I mentioned earlier, sometimes up to 100 in a single attack, which Russia then launches all at once, which then indeed leads to an overwhelming of the Ukrainian air defense, and unfortunately also repeatedly results in these drones hitting various cities across the country.